This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 63 of the Photographing the West podcast. I'm your host, Kirby Flanagan. And yes, I know I missed the June 15th episode. What happened was I was admitted to the hospital about 3 weeks ago for open heart surgery to replace my aortic valve. Thanks to the wonderful doctors and nurses at Carson Tahoe Regional Medical Center, I'm here to tell about it. But enough about me. We're here today to talk with adventure and wildlife photographer Marie Tartar about photographing whales. Marie has the unique experience of not only photographing whales, but swimming with them. Welcome to Photographing the West, Marie.
Thank you.
So tell everybody about yourself as a person and a photographer.
Well, I am probably best known for being an underwater photographer, but I liken it to an infection. While I started with underwater photography takes you to a lot of fantastic destinations, such as Galapagos, Antarctica, etc. And so while my husband and I started as serious photographers underwater, of course, it gradually became topside travel, nature, wildlife. So it just has kind of spread into every arena of our lives. So, of course, we also enjoy city travel as well. So I do a bit of street photography and architecture as well.
Wow, that's quite a spread.
Well, there's a lot to explore and discover out there. And, for me, photography is just intrinsically linked with experiencing and remembering something.
Sure. Yeah, can understand that. So I was intrigued by your recent articles in Photo Focus about snorkeling with and photographing humpback whales. So first, tell everyone about Silverbank, where you were, and what is it, where is it, and how do you get there?
Silverbank is a marine mammal sanctuary. It is roughly halfway between the Dominican Republic and the Turks and Caicos. It's roughly 10 by 20 miles, and it's a relatively shallow, that is compared to the waters around it, a relatively shallow area where the depths are up to, say, 90 to 100 feet max. But the surrounding area is waters of extreme depth, thousands of feet. And so it's kind of, I would say, a little calmer, a little more protected. And it is an area that North Atlantic humpback whales migrate to every year in order to give birth. And if they don't already have a mate, to actually find a mate. So it's pregnant humpback whales will find their way there usually during somewhere around January, February, March, and they'll give birth. But when they do, the calves are obviously small, kind of weak, relatively defenseless. They're not strong enough to actually migrate north to their summertime feeding grounds, which are up along the northeast. So the mothers and the calves will spend some months there, essentially in a nursery, with the mother feeding the calf so it's growing very rapidly and of course gaining strength to make that long, many thousand-mile migration north. In terms of how you get there, there's several major airports. The main access is through the Dominican Republic, which administers this marine mammal sanctuary. So in my case, I flew through the East Coast and found myself in Puerto Plata, which is where most of the operators have the boats that take these yearly trips.
Okay, talk about the experience of snorkeling with humpback whales. That's got to be pretty cool.
It's beyond belief. It's really a magical experience. They're obviously very impressive animals, and most people, of course, only if they get to see them, they're going to experience them perhaps on a whale watching boat and see their surface activities, which are, of course, very impressive, particularly, when a humpback whale launches itself, at rapid speed right out of the water in what we call a breach. Being in the water with humpback whales is I would call it like a religious experience, basically. The mothers and the calves, their interactions, they have a very, very strong bond that is very evident as you observe them. The way that the type of interaction, what was called a soft in-water encounter, goes is that the mothers and the calves are, essentially feeding and resting and growing, but they need to come to the surface on a regular basis to breathe. But the mother can stay down for quite a bit longer than the calf. Typically, one would go out on the water, try to find a not too skittish pair, observe them, and when they go down and rest on the bottom, that's the opportunity to slip into the water as quietly as possible so as not to spook them. And, a group of snorkelers can kind of wait up on the surface, and you can clearly see them down below because usually the depth is somewhere around 50 or 60 feet. And their white fins are quite visible when you're on snorkel on the surface. And you're basically waiting for one or both of the whales to come up for a breath. And in the case of a mother and calf, the calf has to do that pretty regularly, every 3 to 5 minutes. So the mother can stay down quite a bit longer, 15 to 20 minutes. And if the mother is comfortable, the mother may allow the calf to come up for a breath, go back down and then come up for another breath in 3 to 5 minutes. And as long as that mother is not spooked or feeling threatened, one can potentially stay in the water with a mother and calf pair for perhaps an hour, if you're lucky. If the mother gets spooked, she may kind of move off with the calf generally at a pace that one cannot follow on the surface without getting back in the boat and repositioning the boat. But occasionally you get a pair that is perhaps a more mature calf, perhaps a more relaxed mother, but occasionally one can get lucky and have a prolonged encounter. And it's amazing to watch. Some pairs are, the calf is a little shy and kind of, comes up for a breath and rushes right back down sort of into the protection of the mother's arena. But where others come up and they're clearly curious about these strange bobbing swimmers in the water and will actually kind of come around and check you out at closer range. And occasionally even a mother will do that. So it just depends on the whales. They kind of set the agenda. And when it happens and they happen to swim at close enough range to get a good shot, or to actually kind of look literally eye to eye to them, it's an incredible experience.
I gotta believe. Do you have to be an experienced snorkeler to do this kind of thing?
Actually, not really. Obviously, the more comfortable one is in water, the better. But in general, it's actually doesn't really require a high degree of snorkeling ability. For one thing, all of these encounters essentially take place on the surface. Free diving is not really allowed. There's no scuba diving with this, so it's mostly a surface encounter. And in fact, like aggressive swimming after whales is not part of this. Aggressive free diving down to the level of whales, that's, while that is certainly within the capabilities of a good free diver, that is not allowed in a marine mammal sanctuary. And in fact, frankly, the best light is at the surface. So the deeper you go, the less light you have. So photographically, it wouldn't really be an advantage.
Okay. So what gear do you need to get decent photos in this situation?
Well, there's really a range that can be used. In terms of still photography, usually one is looking at a nice land camera. And of course, these days there's many, many choices. But of course, that camera has to be protected from the salt water in which you're swimming. So that usually means a housing. And so literally any camera, almost any camera that you can imagine, somebody makes a housing for that. And so that would be sufficient. On the converse side, there are many people who use something as inexpensive as, say, a GoPro. And they can actually get very good quality, broadcast quality images and video, in fact, with that. It's really a question of proximity. If you're shooting through too much water, you'll get too much scatter, the images won't be very good. But if you happen to have a good close encounter and you're not shooting through so much water, you can actually get very, very good quality with a relatively inexpensive setup like a GoPro. In fact, on my trip in March, there was a Nova filmmaker on board for vacation, but he was using a GoPro, and he said, yes, that was definitely broadcast quality.
Wow. I mean, usually the housings are about as expensive as the cameras, from what I've read anyway.
That's very true. That's very true. But that, in the case of a GoPro, that's probably a few $100s. In the case of a good land camera, yes, the housing can be $2,000 or $3,000. That's absolutely true. That said, there are a lot of good cameras out there. Underwater photographers are subject to the same, desire to upgrade that land photographers are. And so there are a lot of really good cameras and matching housings out there that, someone has upgraded and is now available for a fraction of the cost.
Good to know. So you like the Panasonic GH4 and you couple that with a wet lens. I'm not sure I even know what that is exactly, but why don't you talk about all that?
Okay. Well, in the last year, I upgraded. In the past, in fact, for many years, my underwater camera of choice was a Nikon D7000 in a metal housing made by Subal, which is a Swiss company. In the past year, I upgraded finally, and I went with a completely different type of system. It still has at its base a camera with a lens inside of a metal housing, but this combination is a little different because the camera itself is a Panasonic GH4, which is a good camera. And one of the reasons I went with that is that I am getting more into video, and this particular camera is well regarded in the video arena and is notable for one of the difficulties of doing underwater video is the difficulty of white balancing. And the Panasonic GH4 actually is relatively simple and relatively easy to do. So what I have that paired with is a 14-42 lens. And so that's normally in the usual situation where one is shooting underwater, one would have a camera with a wide angle lens with a dome port. So what I have is actually a camera with this zoom lens, 14-42, with a flat port. And then the dome part, that is the part that makes it wide angle, is actually a wet lens. And what that means is that it is actually, it's optically corrected for underwater, and it goes on the outside of the flat port, which is enclosing the lens. And it gives me a little bit more flexibility because, well, for one thing, inside the camera, I have a zoom lens, meaning that I'm not just tied to one wide angle. The other thing about this is that a lot of wide angle underwater setups rely on maybe like a fisheye lens, which has a very, very wide field of view, like 180 degrees, so wide that you have to worry sometimes about having your own fins in the shot. So sometimes for wide angle, that can be a wonderful thing, but it's maybe a little bit easier with certain types of marine mammals to have a wide angle, but not quite that wide. So with this setup, I have a field of view of around 130 degrees, which is pretty good for sharks, whales, whale sharks, most manta rays, that kind of animal.
So this wetlands, is it actually in the housing, or is it
No, it's outside.
out?
No, okay. It's outside. So inside I have the camera with this 14-42 lens. They're all enclosed in a metal housing, but the front part of that housing is paired with a flat port. So the inside of that is all dry, and then the wet lens is hooked on the outside. And water is actually allowed to fill in the space between the flat port and the wet lens. But it's essentially created for underwater use. It has no utility in any other setting.
Interesting. So what camera settings work best in this environment?
Well, it depends on whether you're talking about shooting surface behaviors of humpback whales or other whales versus shooting underwater. So your settings are going to vary quite a bit. In general, underwater, there's, the f8 and be there rule. Well, that still applies even in this setting. So usually you'd use an aperture around f8. You need a shutter speed fast enough to capture the action, but it doesn't have to be super fast, not as fast as say, capturing topside activity. So for the shots, most of the shots that I used on my recent trip, my settings were somewhere around f8, a shutter speed of 1/125, and an ISO of 400. Conversely, the activity topside, say with a breach, or we had a very exciting outing with what's called a rowdy group or a competitive group, where male humpbacks are kind of racing after a female, kind of basically playing a version of King of the Hill, where the action is happening so fast that speed is kind of paramount. So in that setting, I used a much faster shutter speed, usually around 1/2000th. And so I had to compromise a little bit on the aperture and bump up my ISO. So most of the time I was using settings around 1/2000th, an aperture of 6.3, and an ISO of, I had to bump up to like 800. But that's an instance where, usually in that setting, I'd probably shoot with shutter priority and then kind of, check my histogram and adjust from there.
Yeah, the breaches seem to be over in a second. I know it's a little longer than that, but boy, they fast.
Actually, it's actually very difficult to anticipate exactly where that's going to happen, because it literally is sort of upon you as quickly as possible. But the good news is that with some whales, some of this behavior is repetitive. So, okay, you're going to miss the first one, but that's going to clue you in to roughly the distance away. And in our case, at least one morning, we got very lucky in that we had a very rambunctious calf that just breached over and over and over. So that was a tremendous opportunity to, you don't get the first one, okay, but you're kind of pointed in the right direction, you're looking, you're ready for the next one. And then my camera will shoot like 11 frames a second. So that's the perfect setting to shoot on continuous high, and just kind of, I would sort of pre-focus about the right distance and just hope. But luckily the CAF put on such a show for us that there were lots of opportunities to get it right.
Oh, that sounds like great fun. Yeah, I've done some of that.
It was great.
Done some of that up in Alaska, but obviously you had a very different experience. So I'm curious, when you're shooting underwater, you actually just have the camera underwater, because you said you can't really dive.
That's right. Yes. So basically, you are on the surface, but you are holding the camera underwater, a foot or so. I have an angled viewfinder, a 45-degree viewfinder, and I find that a lot easier to use. So my face can be kind of above the camera, but I can still, see what the camera is seeing versus trying to have to get my face more down level with the camera. So that's something that I use on all my underwater photography.
Oh, I see. So I gather you can use available light for this as opposed to the fancy underwater lighting setups. Is that true?
That is true. And in fact, strobe lighting is used for a lot of underwater photography, but this is an instance where it would actually be a detriment to have strobes on for a number of different reasons. For one reason, strobes underwater only have an effective distance of 6 feet, maybe a little bit more with powerful strobes, but you're not going to get that close to whales, and they're really too large of a subject. So they're such a huge subject that you're going to need to have, in order to even to include the entire animal, you're going to be back too far for your strobe to even reach your subject. So it won't. Not only will it not be lighting your subject, even worse is that when you use strobes, a problem that underwater photographers struggle with all the time is lighting particles in the water, what we call backscatter. So the use of strobes will make that even worse than it already is, because it can be an issue just depending on the light direction, even without the use of strobes. But, so the opportunity to ruin a picture is there. In addition, another good reason not to even bother with strobes is that they slow you down swimming, because your rig it's bulky and heavy already, but you add a couple of strobes on arms and it is that much more of an underwater weight. So it's not something that is used in this type of setting. Available light, you're at the surface, that's what you use. And then your task is to try to optimize the direction of the available light, which generally is with the sun at your back, lighting the animal. The problem with doing the reverse, where the animal is effectively backlit, is one, it's a more difficult exposure, and two, the water will look much more dirty, because suddenly, like, all those particles that are naturally in the water, they will be much more apparent, and it is a tremendous work to try to clean up that kind of image in post. So, for all those reasons, this is an available light shooting situation.
Okay. So what are some of the other technical difficulties with this type of photography besides what you've already mentioned?
Well, frankly, it's a situation where it's really difficult to think on the fly. I mean, it's so exciting. Your charge is to slip into the water as quietly as possible, to swim as quietly as possible. So you're trying to force your fins underwater so that you're not, creating a bunch of splashes and noise that might spook an animal. you can't completely control where in the water you are with respect to the whale. So that's going to be up to your guide. Where and how you slip into the water. And so while they may try to position you with the sun at your back in a more favorable shooting situation, with the direction of the current, there may be other constraints. In general, they don't like to have people slip into the water up current of a whale because there's more opportunity for an animal to be spooked. So you don't always get to control exactly what your relationship is with the animal and the sun. I mean, you just kind of have to optimize what you're presented with. That's one difficulty. Another is, as I said, it's just very difficult to actually think in this situation. It's so exciting seeing these animals and being that close to them that, it's actually very difficult sometimes to even force yourself to put your eye to the viewfinder and look through the viewfinder. It's easy to get just sort of caught up in looking, sort of shooting without looking at the viewfinder, none of which leads to very good photographs. So it's one of these situations where you want to set as many parameters as possible before you slip in the water. You want to try to force yourself to, actually frame, look through the viewfinder, frame it up, and then trying to check your results underwater. That's very difficult because you're bobbing around in the water, trying to keep your eye to the viewfinder. You're at the surface, so there's a lot of light. How difficult it is to see the back of your digital camera when it's light outside. You kind of have to shield it with your hand or find some shade. Well, you've got that problem is magnified when you're on the surface in a brightly sunlit situation in water. So it's actually very difficult to see.
I'm curious, are there other places in the world where you can swim with the whales like this, or is this the only spot?
This is the closest one to the U.S., but there are other places you can go. The two best known areas are both in the South Pacific. French Polynesia is one area, and the other major one is Tonga, which is even further. I've not been to Tonga. I've been to French Polynesia, but not actually for a whale trip. It was for a group responding, which is an event that takes place more in June, July, which is a little too early for whales congregation. So we're actually going next September, and part of our trip will be devoted to hopefully more humpback encounters.
So you can't do it in areas like the Sea of Cortez or off the Hawaiian Islands or anything like that, huh?
Well, there's certainly, one can certainly see humpback whales in Hawaii, but not usually in the water. And it's more controlled. You can certainly go out on whale watching expeditions, but that's all going to be hoping for topside behaviors. And in Hawaii, if you want to be in the water with humpback whales, you usually have to be on a research permit. So obviously that's not going to be available to very many people. The encounters in French Polynesia and in Tonga and in the Dominican Republic are also controlled, but what that means is that only a few people have permits to actually take people out on the water for these soft in-water encounters. For example, in the Dominican Republic, there are only 3 permit holders. And the season, of course, is short. It's basically from January, toward the end of January to early April. So you're talking about 10 weeks maybe, and only 3 permit holders, each with 1 boat, which holds maybe 16 or 18 people. So it's quite controlled in the Dominican Republic. In French Polynesia and Tonga, my understanding is there are both small boat operators that might take people out for a day for, maybe 4 people a day, up to sort of dive boat size with maybe 16 or 18 guests on board, usually going out in 2 or 3 skiffs, so going out in a smaller boat, but so it's quite limited and controlled.
Which is probably a good thing as far as the whales are concerned.
I would certainly agree with that. Yes, but it's in addition, it takes some experience to. It's not like you can just slip in the water anywhere and see whales. Even in Silverbank, you can spend a fair amount of time, an hour or more, sometimes a whole morning or afternoon, just kind of watching the surface, watching for blows, moving the boat, following blows, trying to sort of narrow in on a suitable candidate for an in-water encounter. And some usually you go out morning and afternoon, and you may or may not be successful. It's like all nature photography. The whales are not on a schedule, and you go to the place where you have the maximal possibility of encounters, but they do what they want, and if you get lucky, you may have a nice encounter, but it's not a guarantee.
For sure, yeah. Well, changing directions just a little bit, you mentioned French Polynesia, and even the trip to the Dominican Republic is probably a major undertaking for a lot of folks. Talk about how you go about planning these trips, finding a suitable spot and a good guide, and where to stay and getting there, all those kinds of things.
Sure. Well, in the case of the Dominican Republic, as I mentioned, there are only 3 permit holders, 3 operators. I have experience with 2 of them, and at that point, all 3, I'm sure, have been doing it for many years. So then it's really a question of what boat are they using, because generally they don't own their own boats. They're usually contracting with a dive operator to charter the boat for the season. In my case, in the most recent trip, a friend of mine who is a professional underwater photographer and trip organizer actually organized the trip, and they had a single female berth left, and it was near my birthday, so that was all the excuse I needed to sign myself up for it. But all 3 operators in the Dominican Republic are very experienced with this. At that point, you're just kind of choosing between the particulars of the boat that they use, but probably the most important thing, at least from my point of view, in terms of choosing between the operators, is what their vessels are like that you're spending all day on the water in. So the last time when I went in March, I went with Gene Flipsy, who is the owner and operator of an outfit called Conscious Breath Adventures. And he's been doing it for 17 years. Very, very nice guy. And one of the things I really found compelling about his operation is his pangas, or his the little boats that you're going out on every day, because you're spending a lot of time out there, sometimes 4 hours at a time. So that's a lot of sun exposure. So you want something that's covered. You also want to be able to adequately protect your gear. I mean, while you do intend to put it underwater, you still, want to keep it dry when it's appropriate, as well as your topside gear. So he has 2 tenders. One's named Peck and the other one's named Fluke, which were specifically designed to do this. And I think they were, for spending hours and hours out on the water, I think they were about as comfortable and well designed as they could be. the choice of the tender actually influences how you slip into the water, and that's up to the operator too. I've done it two different ways, and I much preferred this one, which is basically there are sort of rigid seats on the edge of these tenders, and you're just sitting with your camera, and you just slip into the water, feet first, as quietly as possible. 12 years ago, my husband and I did a version of basically the same trip, but with a different operator, where we had to kneel on the edge of the boat, holding our cameras, which are pretty heavy underwater, heavy out of the water. We had to kneel and slide into the water head first, which I can tell you is not that comfortable. So, so there's just subtle things like that. I think, any operator you went out with would do a good job in terms of, tracking the wells, connecting you, getting you into the water. But, you might, it's little things like your comfort out all day on the water that may make slight differences in your selection. So that's the Dominican Republic. In French Polynesia, I haven't done it yet. So I've been there, but to dive, but I haven't actually done well photography there. I hope we have success in September. But again, it's all a question of hooking up with someone who's experienced. In this case, I worked through a dive travel operator who I've traveled with before, who is organizing a trip, and she obviously has a local contacts, and so they steered us toward going to a less well-known area for humpback whale encounters, but with the hope that we have less competition, that is, fewer boats out on the water. So in French Polynesia, Moorea is the area that is best known for this, but that also means there are many, many more operators. And it's, with this type of photography, it tends to be kind of first come, first serve. That is, a boat will sort of follow and get on a mother and calf pair, and then that means that other boats have to find, another whale for an encounter. So we're actually going to an area called Rurutu, which is quite a bit smaller. We'll be staying in a little, what they call a pension, which is like a little family-owned and operated accommodation where the owner will be taking us out in the mornings, and we'll see. So that's definitely a less well-known as a whale watching destination, but the operator in Tahiti says, well, it's going to be, you'll have less competition, and it'll be more personal. So we'll see.
All of this sounds like great fun, but I'm sure people are wondering at this point, what does all this cost?
That's a great question. And the answer is it's not cheap, which of course will be no surprise. In the Dominican Republic, there's most of the operators, at least I checked both the one I went with, Conscious Breath Adventures, and the other one I have experience with, which is Aquatic Adventures. And their prices are roughly the same, and they generally organize it based on a week's charter. So depending on the room you select, which that there's a little bit of a premium for a nicer type of room, but on average, if that's going to run around $4,500 for the week, and for that, of course, some of that is travel time. That is, you're leaving out of Puerto Plata, which is on the north shore of the Dominican Republic, and it takes half a day or so to get to the Silverbank. So part of that is just travel time going to and from. So if $4,500 for the week, and you'll spend about 4.5 days on the water, going out morning and afternoon, usually coming back for lunch, but you may be out for hours at a time. In French Polynesia, it's a little bit hard for me to say exactly what the whale watching component is, but both of our trips both the one that's upcoming, the other components will be diving. And our last trip also was a diving trip. And it seems like it averaged around 500 to 550 a day per person. So that's an estimate. I think it includes some internal flights between different areas of French Polynesia. Like all the diving, it's not cheap, but it is an experience that is absolutely unforgettable.
Plus the cost of airfare to your location, I'm
That's
assuming.
true.
Wow.
That does not include the cost of airfare to get to the Dominican Republic or French Polynesia. It does include essentially all your costs once you're there, all your meals. You're essentially staying in a floating hotel, a boat. So it does include almost all your costs once you're there.
Oh, well, takes away some of the pain, I guess, huh?
That's right. Well, unless you buy a lot of T-shirts, there's not a lot to buy. So.
Yeah, there's that too. Well, before we go, tell everyone where they can find you and your photography and how to get in touch if they want to.
Absolutely. So my personal website is, with my husband, is aperturephotoarts.com. That's aperture, like the aperture of a camera, photoarts.com. No spaces, no periods, just aperturephotoarts.com. And then I also write articles for photofocus.com. That's photofocus, again, no spaces, photofocus.com. And you can actually search photofocus by my last name, Tartar, Tartar, if I've written about Antarctica, Japan, humpback whales, just basically anything I happen to be shooting and am learning from at the time. So that's probably the easiest way. And I think that's the way you found me, right? Photofocus.com? Right.
Yeah, that was a great article. And I'll put a reference to that in the show notes so people can find it and read it. And there's, some additional information there as well. So, well, thanks for being on Photographing the West, Marie. It's been a great pleasure and I've learned a lot. Hopefully our audience has as well. Show notes can be found at www.flanaganphotos, spelled FLANAGANPHOTOS.com. Thanks for listening, and barring further unexpected events, we'll be back on our regular schedule going forward. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.